Welcome to MetaPod, the podcast where we discuss operational execs and organizations that make and move stuff, and our common headaches, digital transformation, the forever labor shortage, and doing more with less. And now, the host of MetaPod, Ron Crabtree.
It's Ron Crabtree here with another episode of MetaPod, where I bring in thought leaders from around the world to talk about the three common challenges that industrial organizations face, the forever labor shortage, digitization, digital transformation, AI is part of that big conversation going on out there, and then the endless pressure to do more with less resources, people, logistics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm really looking forward to talking with you here today. I've got Clif Triplett joining us here to talk about this general topic around AI value at risk, governing the digitization of work before trust outruns control. So I think that's a pretty interesting conversation. I've been having ongoing conversations 10 times a week, it seems like, with professionals that are grappling in industry around AI. How do we monetize that? AI supply chain roundtables, many, many other conversations. So I've had the privilege to, talk with a lot of folks on all sides of the equation, from my customers that are grappling with using these tools, to consultants that are doing this in the field, to advanced AI pioneers to help build some of this software. Believe it or not, it got started in the 50s. So it's like, okay, so there's many things that are not new. In fact, I was talking with Chief Purchasing Officer of one of the largest banking systems in Europe earlier today, and he says AI is not like math, right? It doesn't necessarily reason, but it certainly can do the math like really well. So I found that pretty interesting. So Clif's going to share some really great insights with us here. I'm going to share a couple of, I'll ask him to talk more about himself here in a second, but this episode's for you if you're feeling a lot of pressure from employers, management, or the board of directors around using AI now, and how that impacts your lean manufacturing operations, IT, cybersecurity, data quality engineering, and transformation work, which is certainly near and dear to my heart and most of my customers. Maybe you're seeing shadow spreadsheets out there, duplicated data extracts, department-built data, department-built data lakes, I should say, unregistered AI pilots. Oh boy, that sounds interesting, forming across the business. And you suspect AI is being trusted because it's useful, but not because we necessarily have it governed, tested, bounded, and monitored properly. And Clif, in my mind, is one of the top 5 people on the planet when it comes to cybersecurity, and AI is a big concern there. So Clif, tell us a bit about you and your background.
Ron, well, first, thanks for having me on your show. Yeah, my background, I have a lot, but I'm going to focus it on today's topic. So I think, we talk about industrial operations. One of the opportunities I had was I was brought into General Motors. At the time, we had 600 plants. And the idea was, how do we get value from them? How do we standardize the processes? And at the same time, General Motors always is concerned about quality. And they said, well, can you also help us lift the quality bar? And so what we did was look at them together. I think that's the right way. Now, as we went through that, we also looked at how can we use automation and the virtual factory concept to improve operations, to improve productivity, particularly in the design of the car, building the factories, changing over tools and so forth. And what's happened since then is, and during that period I was there for sure, we were doing more and more automation of, say, design of each of those things. And this is where AI is really coming into play in not only designing the product, but designing the way we build the product, service the product, and such. And with each of those additional uses of technology, particularly AI, we actually get greater value, but we also introduce more risk if it were to be compromised. Now, I'm going to take it to another opportunity I was at Baker Hughes. And at Baker Hughes, we did offshore drilling. We were the number 1 offshore driller. Now, can you imagine the way we did it was horizontal drilling? And basically the way I like to tell the story is we flew underground drones. Okay. And we would go find the reservoir and help drill the right hole and harvest the oil at the reservoir. But can you imagine if someone took over that and we had another big Gulf leak? That would be just horrible. So actually it risks your whole business. And so again, security was important. And again, we saw opportunities to introduce AI-like technology, and this will get to where I think our conversation comes later, is we had to trust the information, we had to trust the scope, and we had to make sure our AI environment was protected. And then after that, I was brought into President Obama's staff, and I was asked to look at the IT and cyber risk across the federal government, understand the underlying risks, and then put forth strategies and then lead those strategies to mitigate that risk. And now I'm with Watchman Global Alliance, and I do that for other governments and major clients around the world.
Awesome. Yeah. So for the audience's benefit, you're not going to find many people that have looked at all sides of this from every industry's perspective and has worked through a lot of the practical challenges of how we deal with these sorts of challenges. And there's three different things I've asked Clif to offer up as diagnostics. Like these are just general things any industry should really be looking at, thinking about critically. And we're going to start with three different diagnostics. One point around treating data and information as corporate assets, another around compartmentalizing data to bond the AI scope and exposure. One of the things that I'm hearing a lot from guests on my podcast is the word for 2026 is context, right? And putting a box around things. So I think this relates. And then how we go about registering AI initiatives and how we assign value risk control level control. So this is pretty advanced stuff, but super important for folks in industry, particularly if you have products that integrate technologies or access other technologies, and there's all of that. And then, of course, all of our internal use as well. I mean, one of the things that's super scary is if we have employees attempting to do something, improve a process like quoting, and to have that information escape into large language models and people being able to use prompts to come in and hack us, that's like super scary stuff that we're going to have to get in front of. So Clif, take it away here. What would be that first area we would diagnose? We're looking for that practical. What do you look for? How do you measure that? How do I understand the nature of the risk or opportunity for the organization? You got to pretend the audience doesn't have a technical background.
Yeah, I want to cover the ones you named there, Ron, but I think the first one really starts with the concept and the culture of the corporation as to how do they look at information. Okay. And as I look at more and more organizations, they haven't quite all matured to a point where they really look at information as a corporate asset. And I think that's important. And if it was a corporate asset, two of the big questions you need to know in the context of what we're talking about is where did this asset come from? What's its provenance? Okay. Is this something we control, we're comfortable with, or do we just kind of pull it off the internet from some freeware site? Okay. And then what are we doing to protect and ensure the integrity of that information? It's not being manipulated, compromised, and so forth. And this becomes probably the first thing. Now, I've worked with a number of entities, and this is one of the first things we get into is they have critical assets, and they talk about factories and data centers and so forth. And we start talking about the information, which they really start to realize, wow, this is probably our most important asset. Well, first you got to raise it up to that. Then you got to go through the drill and really do an inventory of your assets. What are they? Where did they come from? How are we protecting them? And this really leads, us into the use of AI. So if you're going to trust the output, you got to trust the input. And I'll just stop with that one as the first one, Ron.
Yeah. So walk this out for us. Give me a case study example, a little more granularity without disclosing anything you shouldn't, right? So I'm trying to arm the audience with, they've got they're sitting in a boardroom, they're in a different function. They're going to walk down the hall and have conversations with folks that should know the answers to these questions. What am I asking for? What's the evidence, the data, the proof that we've got a handle on this? Or how do I identify we've got a gap we need to deal with?
Well, there's a couple things there. First, how do we know and how do we position it as an asset? And I think what you got to look at first is what would happen if it was compromised? What if somebody else got hold of it? What if somebody changed it or manipulated it? What would it cause us? What kind of harm would that cause our business? And most companies have something they consider what's being material. And there's usually some kind of financial number associated with that. Bigger the company, the bigger the number. But you ask yourself, if this were to be compromised, would I hit that number? Okay, is this really critical? And so that's the first thing. Let's identify the value of that information. And often, unfortunately, is through the risk of it being compromised or lost. At General Motors, for example, we may have a design of a car. Well, what's the cost if that car is lost or manipulated? Can you imagine if the safety controls were manipulated? The cost would be for sure in the billions. Okay. So what kind of controls do we have put in place? This brings us to some of those other topics you raised, Ron. And the first one I always look at, and I've done some work for the federal government when I started my career. I was working with on some top secret level systems that were handling top secret information. And the real key to that is one, understand the risk of the information, the value of information, classified, secret, top secret, critical, whatever mechanism you use to classify information. And then it comes into the controls. Well, the first control, and I think the most important control any organization can look at, is this concept of compartmentalization. Okay. Taking the information and not putting it in a lake, but let's talk about a very small pond, maybe a puddle. Okay. What information do I need to perform the task? And that is all the information that we should put in that compartment. And then we need to see who should have access to that compartment. And we have some people, it could be every day. That's what they do. And sometimes it's a one-off, and maybe it's only read. And if you really tighten it up, this is probably, in my mind, the number one thing you need to do. Find your information, compartmentalize it, limit the access control. Ron, I didn't want to say something.
All right. So let's talk about that for a second. Something that, has kind of hit me and interesting concept is, the notion of layered agents, the notion of using agents as if they're employees. Let's think about an org chart that works for you and you have agents to do different things. So I think part of that conversation, Clif, if I'm understanding you, is what people, organizations, blah, 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 have access, but also what tools or agents, APIs, whatever. I think you're talking about all of that, right?
Absolutely. And actually, in the more sensitive information, the more critical I become of both. Okay. First, I try to go to, and especially the concept of privilege access management, to what controls and privileges is, whether it's an AI agent or a person given, limit it as to the greatest extent possible. And what I often work with companies is how many people have privilege access to this information? And the objective is zero. Okay. If you need to have privilege access, make it a change control for a specific time or for particular action. Not this, it's open all the time. That's just crazy, especially in production. Now in tests, it's a different story. But when you get to production, you should seek to go zero. And then if it's, the other point you made is systems access. Okay. You can put very controlled access controls on your information, such that the only thing it can do is accept these variables and therefore produce these outputs. And if it's anything beyond the whitelisted list of variables, it's denied and actually the link is shut down. So if you're not moving to whitelisting on sensitive information, the transactions you support, I think that's another risk if it's highly sensitive information.
Yeah, I need to interrupt because somebody was talking about this prompting, right? There's an attack method to bypass. So what you just described sounds to me like a bit of a firewall to help protect you from prompting types of attacks. You know what I mean by that?
Absolutely. And, I think anyone whose strategy is blacklist, that works for some things, but I think unfortunately it's a thing of the past. If it's really important information, you really need to move to whitelist. And when I say whitelist, it's through the whole 7-layer protocol stack, and then actually into the transaction and into the variables in which the transaction will process.
Wow. Okay.
And that seems like
Didn't
a
mean
lot.
to interrupt.
But
this
not
is good
everything.
stuff. This is really good stuff.
Yeah, that seems like a lot, but you don't have to do it for everything. I mean, don't take a peanut butter strategy and says we're going to spread it everywhere. No, you have a few critical assets, information assets, and this is where you apply that level of content.
So is that everything you want to talk about? Treating data and information as assets, or ready to move on to compartmentalizing? Or it sounds like you got into that already.
Yeah, I really think we're right into that. So, like I said, once you get the asset, then you compartmentalize and compartmentalize. One of the things we did, and you said in your opening comments, you talked about the words in terms such as data lake. And where a data lake is, we take all our friends and family data and shove it in there. So whoever needs anything, they're going to find it. It's in a lake. Well, that was a really good strategy 10 years ago. And I wouldn't even say it was good then, but it was a very popular thing to do. It's about the worst thing you could do today with the information, because two things happen there. One, especially in the world of AI, we're asking it to crawl this lake and look around and find whatever you can find. Well, most of the AI systems don't understand the bounds of the lake and they just keep going. And we're seeing that in the news all too often. Okay, so what we really need to do in the compartmentalization is not only compartmentalize the access, but where the AI can move across inside that lake. And really what you want to do is you want to create islands. Now, one of the things I worked another client with is they were in this data lake concept. We moved it to an asset type thing. We got to compartmentalization and so forth. But the concern was the business needs access to all this information. And we're going,
Right.
well, we're not going to deny it, but we're going to containerize it. So what they would able to do is go to the help desk and ask for this access to this information. They would have to define what they need, okay, and what its purpose was. And then they had basically automated tools that would create that containerized world for them. And then they would have a limited set of people, whoever they determined the business needed to have access to it, access to that, let's call it pond. Okay. And I think that's where we really need to move to is we need to eliminate the need for people to build their own lakes or to have access to the entire enterprise lake. One quick story. Some of you were probably impacted by the OPM breach way back there in 2015. Well, the fact of the matter was what wasn't really compromised to any extent was the core system. What was really compromised in many cases were the copies people made so they could do their task. Okay, we need to eliminate the copies because often the copies do not have the controls. So, but whoever was compromised doesn't care what the root cause was. Okay, they were compromised. You're compromised. So you need to look at, your data and what you're giving to AI, and do you have it controlled? And people are given access to, is it a copy or is it the controlled environment?
So how do I quantify all that, right? This is all great advice, but I mean, what's the evidence I'm looking for? What's the documentation? How do I validate? Yes, in fact, right? We have thought that through, that we have what am I looking for? And a little more specificity if you could.
Yeah, I think you can look at it from two sides. Okay. We got our company, let's say, not my company, but the company you are working at is compromised. Well, that didn't work. Okay. The other is, where don't you see the problem? Okay. And what are they doing? And I tell you what, the guys who are not being compromised are doing things more like what I'm talking about. Another term I use is something they call I-BOM, the information bill of material. This is kind of like the software bill of material. Do I really understand the provenance and integrity controls on my information? So do I have an I-BOM and an I-BOM management practice? If you do, you're probably going to find in your own company with very little time and experience that you aren't going to have conflicting information being presented, for example, at a staff meeting. When I was a CIO at a company, this I-BOM was an important concept, and we stopped using PowerPoints and went to the master source of data. And this is what the CEO we looked at was this. If you had different information, that was interesting, but then you usually got kind of challenges to, why do you have different information? Why aren't you using our source of truth? And usually because they went and made another copy, they changed the integrity rules, they changed the provenance, didn't have the same controls upon which we were going to try to run the business. So I think you could find very simply in your own business, if you're not practicing I-BOM or some of the controls and things like that, you're going to find yourself where multiple people have different answers to the same question. I think that's probably your almost number one piece of evidence.
All right. So that's a great question. I have a new wrinkle in my brain. I learned something today I hadn't really thought about quite that way. So I-BOM, right? So bill of materials, manufacturing felt, I get what a bill of materials is, right? But this information bomb is an interesting way of stating that, because you're thinking about, here's something you need a decision to make. whatever process you need to run, but what's that bill of materials for the information that's required? So
Yeah.
I've been getting at that with some, and I'm asking a question here, sideways question. One of the things I've been doing with customers is we go through and do value stream mapping, and we do a pretty deep dive into an activity-based costing model to really understand the key few steps where the real leverage is cost, quality, speed, customer experience, so we can focus where to apply technologies and also basic Lean Six Sigma improvement techniques. It's very, very effective. And one of the things I've been adding in the last several years is a matrix, if you will, for each step in the process. What are the IT touches, right? Which IT systems and sources of information are we touching to actually do the task? So that's a form of what you just described, this I-BOM, right? Where we were saying at this task level, let's just say it's a product development process where we're developing, doing the quote, right? And at this step in the process, I'm getting into this engineering system, these customer records, this purchasing and supply chain data, this manufacturing cost data, right? All of those would be components of what you're describing as an I-BOM. And am I even close to what you mean by an I-BOM?
Yes and no. Okay. So I don't know where the audience is on value stream mapping. I love value stream mapping. And I call it enhanced value stream mapping in terms of how I approach it, which is a little bit exactly what you're talking about, Ron. Okay. Let's talk about in value stream mapping, you have the resources, okay, such as systems. But yes, this is where you put the information in. What you didn't say is, for example, we also typically, if you're doing value stream mapping, you're doing Lean Six Sigma, right? Where can we take out waste and where are the defects? So under I-BOM, we're looking also at the Six Sigma components as to what could compromise the integrity of the information. Okay.
Wow.
So you didn't mention that, but one of the things I found in General Motors, for example, is just the smallest compromised information can make a big difference. So I have to be focused on where and how I collect that information and how I process that information. If, for example, in manufacturing, you're out of calibration, then what's the integrity of your calibration data? Okay, so you have to go back and look at that process, which whatever it is cutting metal, let's say. How important is calibration to the quality of information, especially if I'm using AI to manage that cutting thing and changing the cutting path because the bit's wearing? Okay, well, it all comes back to calibration, which is a piece of information. So I have to look at that I-BOM and the risks to the integrity and where am I getting that information from? Do I trust that sensor? Is it my sensor? Is it what the manufacturer says it should get out of 5,000 runs? Or am I actually measuring it? Okay, so those are some examples, and it definitely plays into value stream mapping. You need to look as you're going through it, the information, and then I'm running my process on. Do I trust it? Do I know where it came from?
All right. So you've added a layer there that I've never really quite thought about that way, but this is super important because one of the things I look for is that, we work on value stream mapping processes, first time capability, right? What's our first time capability to get it right at the step level? What you're describing is going a step beyond that and examining the nature of risk in the process. How reliable and is that really the only place the data is available to us? You're taking that whole capability question another layer deeper. Because again, we can't fix everything. So how do you identify the critical things that really matter? So we properly are leveraging our control strategy and also, of course, how we're going to use AI is kind of the subject at hand. So very, very interesting. So if I'm, walking down the hall, so tell me about our I-BOM analysis and they look at me funny. I know I've got a big gap, right?
Yeah, I would say most companies have an I-BOM problem. Well, the first problem is they haven't even identified which pieces of information they should run an I-BOM against.
Wow. So all by itself, that would allow me as a leader in an organization to just walk down the hall and have a conversation. Help me understand our strategy, what data and information you've completed, what evaluations have been completed, what's our risk and right? How big is our problem? Or what's the risk of having a big problem is a way to kind of put a measurement to that, right? To understand, do we have a burning platform to really go after this?
Well, I think the larger the company, the bigger the return, which is usually the case. But if you start thinking about the liability, whether that's, say, warranty or regulatory or lawsuits or whatever it might be, you know, if you identify where the greatest risk is, okay, and particularly if you're going to put AI on top of this thing now,
Hmm.
okay, and it's now operating on questionable I-BOM or undefined I-BOM, this is where you're going to almost definitely find yourself in trouble. And so I think, back to the point of compartmentalization and I-BOM and assets, these are three very tightly interlocked concepts. And if
Yes.
you're not talking about them today, it may be something you want to talk about tomorrow. It's not incredibly difficult in my mind to think about the concepts. What takes time is to actually collect and work that, but start at the top, most critical, and work down until it becomes part of your culture. And when it's part of your culture, then it just, you're going to be in a much safer space as you think about it.
Yeah, we've been doing LinkedIn Live events, and I've been putting out there a little simple tool people can use to 6 different elements of exposure right around AI and industry. And in future conversations, I'm going to be unpacking this I-BOM thing as part of that whole, the data and the management understanding of the data you need to work with is a critical element. So let's pivot here to kind of get into the third diagnostic that you wanted to get into around registering AI initiatives, assigning value risk control level. Help unpack what we're looking for around that challenge.
Sure. I think, everyone is so motivated right now to innovate and do things better, faster, enabled by AI. And AI, there's many forms, there's many things it can do to help us. But I'm just going to kind of go through at Watchman, we kind of look at it from a 1 to 5 scale. And anybody can put anything in a 1 to 5 scale, but we've done such a thing. But a 1, just for the sake of conversation, would be something like, hey, I want to use ChatGPT as like an advanced Google, ask a question. I'm not going to share any corporate information. So what's the risk? It's pretty low. Okay. And particularly if you acknowledge what it is, but most people are just trying to understand the topic better. Okay. That's low business risk. Now, on the other hand, if, as I said before, I was doing a safety control feature for an automotive maker, or I was doing underground drone driving, okay, this is exceptionally high risk. And the more I incorporate AI into that operation, well, I'm probably going to get higher value because I can build these systems faster and maybe even better. But if compromised, the risk is high. So I can tell you at one of the companies we're doing drilling, and we start really understanding more and more about where we're drilling, how we're drilling, and taking all these metrics in. We're taking them in faster than a human could process. So we had to use some systems information. But it also allowed us to more than double the length of the drilling length we could do. So great value, but also great risk. So that would be, let's call it a number 5. Now, I think
Mhm.
what you have to do is now look at your cyber capabilities. And as I've been looking at enterprises, even what I would consider mature enterprises, most of them are probably just above a 1 on cybersecurity capability or other controls as it pertains to AI. Now, if you went pre-AI, they're probably doing very well. But this AI changed the game. We have different risks. Okay. I-BOM becomes far more important. Things like that. So, AI drift. There's just so much. Anyway, so what we want to do now is, again, kind of the terms we use at Watchman is we say, okay, you got your foundational stuff. This is the basics. Everybody should do this. You probably have a firewall. You should, do malware protection on your endpoints and so forth. Then you come up to the next level, which we refer to as prudent. And that is like, well, you probably should do it based on your industry, because if you don't, you ever got a lawsuit, you're probably going to get sued for this because you're not doing what everybody else is doing. So that probably wasn't prudent, right? So prudent. Then move to the next level, which we refer to as advanced. And that says, well, for this circumstance, we probably need to do a little bit more because the risk is higher. And then in certain situations, especially if it's a new technology upgrade, you need to move to that emerging kind of security control. So when you go through and look at your AI programs, the idea is you register them. And what you're registering is, what platform am I using? Kind of your I-BOM. What am I looking at? And you're looking at whatever your risk tolerance is in your corporation. Most people have some kind of risk assessment. And then you typically have the system owner, the CIO, chief data officer, CISO kind of roles look at this and say, based on our guiding principles for rating that, this is a 1, 2, 3, 4 on the value side, 5. And therefore, on the other side, what level of security do I need? And what we find, and we refer to the collective, is your AI maturity. It's the balance between the value and the risk controls you have in place. And I would tell you today, most people are unbalanced. Okay. And unfortunately, they're more unbalanced in the sake they're asking more of the AI than they have the appropriate controls.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. All right, cool. Let's pivot. We're going to pivot now and kind of get into that sage advice that you might offer the audience. So they've listened to us talk here. They're beginning to identify we probably have exposure here. We definitely have some areas we need to focus on. And it's a big ask. So what's the sage advice about what to go do? What are the logical steps you would take in each of these 3 areas we talked about? And we touched about treating the data and information as assets, compartmentalizing the data, and then registering, et cetera, et cetera. Give us some really sharp go-dos that we can't just go Google easily.
Yeah, I really think it's kind of a walk. Okay. It starts with, what are the big mission of our business? Do we understand that?
Mhm.
And therefore, what are the processes that we must have to execute that mission? And then this is where we bring in the I-BOM. Okay. What is the I-BOM for that process? And have I actually built the I-BOM? Do I understand what information it is? And then what controls do I have on that information? And start with the most important and work down. And then when you get down to that control point, ask yourself, do we really have the IT security controls, the processes, the policy, and even the trained skills to manage and mitigate the risk of an AI environment? And I think that's really my advice. Take the walk, but don't stop until you've asked yourself, in this new world, have we put together the appropriate controls for now moving into AI at the level we're attempting to use it?
Yeah, so there needs to be really strong leadership alignment around what are the key leverage points? What's our basis of competition? What do we need to be better at in the future to grow, maintain market share? What differentiates us or could differentiate us as a business? Get really focused about what really matters, because we can't boil the ocean, right? We can't try to fix everything at the same time. We've got to prioritize. And there's a point of diminishing returns, right, for doing some of these things. It's kind of finding that sweet spot of the payoff versus the risk, right? The balance. You talked about the balance, and we're unbalanced right now. We're kind of like we're jumping into that AI thing, but not really understanding the risks and finding that correct balance. So that was really good. Keep going here. I didn't mean to sidetrack you here, but what else do we go do?
Well, I'm going to say the one other thing I've found is people have too many critical assets. Okay. I went to one company, they measured their critical assets. They said, oh, this is important. We got to register them all. They had thousands. But once you get to thousands or even hundreds, it's just an exercise of documentation. Nobody's going to use it. Okay. So I work with the leadership teams and usually say, we can't have more than 25 critical asset types. Okay. You don't get more than 25. Okay. I had a company that it was measured absolutely in thousands, and I think we got down under 20. Okay. Now, the only way you're going to do that is you have to have a second class, and that's called important. Okay. Because otherwise everything's critical. Important.
Repeat that second.
Critical's first, and then you got important stuff. Because if you don't have important, everything's critical. Okay. Now, important, maybe you have 100. And then the second thing under both important and critical, you have essential. Okay.
Right.
And that is, I have a data center, that's a critical asset, but if somebody takes out the AC, I lose the data center. So the AC may become the essential asset. Well, this also can be true for information. What is the essential information that could destroy a process or what have you? And I think if you get to that, when we got from thousands to like 19, it was transformational to that enterprise. Okay, because people really started to use it. They started making decisions. They started to know and how and where to put the investment. So I would say that's another really important thing is, refining your definition of critical, important, and don't forget the concept of essential, because really it's the essential where you really is your, hypodermic needle focus of
Right.
where you need to put your efforts on I-BOMing.
I really like that. Resonates with the advice. It's got to be laser focused on where you're going to spend your time and money. And you got to know you're working on the right stuff. That's really going to make a difference in total performance, speed to market, customer experience, or not going out of business because we missed something really important that kills us.
Yeah, no, I want to add one more thing. Another very common mistake that I would ask your audience to think about not making is when they find the problem, go, oh, we need to go buy another shiny object. Okay, so we're going to go to the market and buy a piece of software, hardware, what have you. But as I look at trying to solve problems, I look at it from 6 dimensions. Software being one, hardware being one, process being one, policy being one, the skilled workforce being one, and architecture being one. Okay, so there's 6.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I've been brought into many companies, and usually I get brought in because the board or somebody's saying, hey, we're being asked to spend, I'll just pick a number, $20 million on shiny objects. Okay, should we spend $20 million on shiny objects? I have never found that to be the right answer. Typically, they have so many existing assets in people, in shelfware or whatever, tools that weren't configured correctly, that I know in that 120 million scenario, we got it down to less than 2 and got twice the result because we looked at it from 6 dimensions instead of just chasing the shiny object. So I would just challenge everyone, ask yourselves, should we chase the shiny object, or have we really exhausted these other 5 dimensions?
Great advice. Great advice. Clif, what else would you recommend we go do in the light of the diagnostics you provided, some of this conversation? What are the other important go-dos you haven't touched yet in your mind?
I think is, probably one of the greatest risks you have is your supply chain. Okay. And so you need to look at your supply chain and ask yourself, are they creating a compromise to your I-BOM integrity, your privilege access controls, the bounds upon which your AI can cross? Because, depending on who you are, chances are your supply chain could be far more vulnerable than your own. But when you connect to them, that is now the weak link in your security chain. So be very controlled on that. Remember, I talked about whitelisting. I would highly recommend looking at what's happening with your connection to your supply chain and what level of whitelisting can you put on that connection.
Yeah, so I need to interrupt because it just happens. I talked with somebody earlier today, chief purchasing officer for a large bank. And one of the things he said to me, I found pretty interesting, and it ties back to this I-BOM thing. He says, Europe is driving these massive new layers of ESG compliance. He says, manufacturing has been doing it for 30 years, right? In other words, traceability, was it the, child labor, all that kinds of stuff. He says, but the rest of industry, like financial services, is now getting pressure, and it's being driven out of Europe big time, and it'll of course end up being everywhere, is understanding your responsibility and control for your tier 2, 3, 4, even tier 5 suppliers. He says, now, this is getting really gnarly for me because now I'm talking about laptops I'm buying from Dell. I'm talking about consulting services I'm purchasing. I'm talking about these things we're spending money on as a financial institution that aren't tangible goods. So how do I grapple with that? And I think you're getting at part of that challenge here.
Yeah, but I'm also looking at, I've done some financial institutions, and when I look at some of the decisions they have, they're not all equal. Okay. I've seen where some people have the authority to make a $1 billion transaction. Okay. But it's the same control they have on $100 transaction. And it's like, you need to kind of take a look back to your risk level and say what controls. Now, when we went in there, I went in there predominantly for a cyber risk situation. But for this, it was like, this isn't you have the risk, but this can be controlled by those other dimensions, which you already have controls on. You just haven't applied them to this situation, because what they did not do, back to my point, start at the mission, start at the core processes and work down. They really hadn't gone through a deliberate process like that, and it missed. They had some processes and transaction types where they really hadn't gone through the control analysis because they were just a little too peanut butter in their approach to control and didn't want to encumber a simple checking customer, let's say. And it's like, well, yeah, that's the checking customer. This person over here is making the financial institution decisions to buy major investment assets. This is a different world, and there should be different controls. And I think you're starting to see that now more in the regulatory market, where they're saying, yeah, they recognize there's different type of transactions and different controls, but you can get ahead of it. And why wait for a government authority? Because by then, what they're going to put forward is, if you haven't at least achieved that, you're in trouble, because they're putting down the minimums, not the best practice.
All right. Awesome. So any last bits of advice for our audience before we get into wrap up?
No, I think, my biggest thing is free first. Okay. Take a look at what you already have in terms of assets and focus those energies where the greatest risk is, because that's also where the greatest return will be.
Awesome. Good job, Cliff. You've exceeded my expectations. So let's pretend the audience, like what you had to say. They want to get in touch with you, learn more, pick your brain, whatever. How do people get in touch with you?
So it's pretty simple. My name's Clif with one F. Okay. Clif, CLIF, at watchmanglobalalliance.com. One big word. And I would hope to hear from you, and happy to help you if you have questions. And if you just want to talk about it, some of your audience, I'd be happy to just have a conversation as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Cliff. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode of MetaPod. Please like it. Please share it out with your network. We really look at this as a great opportunity to give something back to the business community and help to connect great people with Cliff, with folks who are looking for the cutting edge. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you for joining MetaPod. For requests on topics or to ask questions, you can connect with Ron Crabtree 3 ways: via email at metapod@metaexperts.com, via LinkedIn, or by calling him directly at 734-425-1455, extension 103. Lastly, if you love the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review on your favorite podcast app. We truly appreciate all your support.